April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above northern France. Oberleutnant Karl Weiss looked down through the crystal curve of his Focke-Wulf canopy and decided, almost instantly, that the Americans had brought the wrong airplane to Europe. Below him, the new fighters were climbing in slow, wide circles through the pale spring air. They looked swollen through the fuselage. Their noses were blunt. Their wings seemed too small for the weight they carried. Nothing about them suggested elegance. Nothing about them suggested danger. His wingman laughed over the radio and asked what those strange machines were supposed to be. Karl watched them another second, then answered with the calm contempt of a veteran. American mistakes. Karl had earned the right to be arrogant. He had flown against British fighters over the Channel and against Soviet pilots, in skies where winter itself tried to kill men before the enemy could. He had seen aircraft that climbed like thrown knives and turned so tightly they seemed to pivot around anger. A fighter, in Karl's world, was supposed to be lean, fast to climb, fast to answer, fast to punish hesitation. The machines below him looked like none of those things. They looked industrial. They looked overbuilt. They looked like something a factory manager would admire and a fighter pilot would mock. History would prove otherwise, but on that April morning, history had not yet reached the cockpit. Below Karl, one of the American pilots trying to hold formation, was Second Lieutenant Tom Sloan, 23 years old, Pennsylvania-born. Civilian life interrupted so quickly by war that he sometimes still felt surprise when he looked down and found a uniform wrapped around his own body. The P-47 Thunderbolt had not impressed him the first time he saw it on the ramp in England. It was too big, too broad, too mechanical. It looked less like a fighter than like a machine designed to pull down a barn and then keep moving. But the first time he pushed the throttle forward and felt that radial engine drag the airplane into motion, he understood something important. Beauty was not the point, power was. The Republic P-47 had first flown on May 6, 1941. It had been conceived in panic, refined in urgency, and delivered into a war that was already teaching hard lessons about altitude, firepower, and survivability. By the time the first production models reached the Army Air Forces in March 1942, the airplane had already become something no European pilot would have designed on purpose. Empty, it weighed roughly 5 tons. Loaded, far more. Late-war P-47Ds would reach a maximum speed of 433 miles per hour, carry bombs or rockets, and climb to a service ceiling of 42,000 feet. Its broad frame wrapped itself around one gigantic promise. If the enemy hit you, you might still come home. The first combat sweep of Thunderbolts over Western Europe came in April 1943. That mattered because it meant two truths were colliding in the same sky. The Germans had experience. The Americans had potential. Experience wins the first meetings more often than not. Potential wins the long war. Tom knew none of that in abstract terms as he tightened his gloves and kept one eye on formation. What he knew was simpler. His oxygen mask felt damp, his hands felt too large inside his gauntlets, and somewhere above them were German pilots who had been fighting since before he had ever seen Europe. The first attack came with textbook cruelty, sun behind the Germans, height in their favor, a slashing pass timed to catch the Americans while they were still climbing and still thinking like men in training. Karl rolled in, fired a short burst at one Thunderbolt pulling upward too steeply, and expected to see it shatter into the sort of quick wreckage that settles arguments in the air. Instead, the American machine shuddered, trailed fragments, and kept climbing. Not well, not beautifully, but stubbornly. Karl overshot, climbed again, and looked back with irritation rather than alarm. One thing had already become obvious. The new American fighter did not die politely. Back in England, the debriefing room felt colder than the weather outside. Pilots complained in the sharp, half-angry tone young men use when fear has not yet found its proper shape. The Thunderbolt was too heavy, too slow in the climb, too unforgiving if the fight became tight and low. Several men had nearly died trying to force it into the sort of turning combat a Spitfire might survive. At the front of the room, an older officer let them finish. Then he said the sentence that would begin changing everything. If you try to prove that airplane is a Spitfire, you're going to be buried in it. The room went quiet, because everyone understood what he meant. The P-47 had been designed around a huge Pratt & Whitney radial engine and the complicated breathing machinery of a turbo supercharger system. Exhaust gases fed the system that helped the Thunderbolt keep power high above altitudes where thinner air began robbing other fighters of performance. It was engineering, not romance. To German pilots looking up at it in 1943, the result seemed ridiculous. The aircraft had the heavy, swollen look of something built by people who trusted horsepower more than elegance. What they did not understand yet was that horsepower, altitude, and structural strength would eventually become their own form of elegance. Not the elegance of a sword, the elegance of an avalanche. Tom learned to respect the Jug the way men learn to respect dangerous machinery, not by admiring it, by surviving it. Training had already killed pilots in the Thunderbolt. It ground-looped on landing, punished sloppy takeoffs, and in dives could push into compressibility so violently that the controls seemed to freeze under a pilot's hands. Some men feared it before combat ever began. Yet others, the ones who stayed with it long enough, began saying the same thing in different words. You did not dance with the P-47. You aimed it. That distinction mattered, because a pilot who stops asking a machine to flatter him can finally begin learning what the machine is actually for. Carl did not think much about the first encounter after it ended. That, too, tells you something. In spring 1943, the Luftwaffe still assumed command of direct fighter combat over Western Europe, whenever skill and numbers felt remotely balanced. The Americans were arriving, yes. Their bombers were reaching deeper, yes. But confidence still belonged to German veterans who trusted their own experience more than any rumor carried home by stressed young pilots. Then the reports began. One damaged Thunderbolt had returned across the channel when no one thought it could. Another had dived away so fast, pursuit became foolish. Another had fired a burst so dense at convergence that a German fighter seemed to come apart rather than simply fall. The laughter did not stop, not yet, but it had begun to work harder. What the Germans were noticing in fragments, the American ground crews were noticing in sheet metal. Staff Sergeant Eddie Nolan, Tom's crew chief, judged aircraft by what they brought home in their skin. One evening he walked around a returning Thunderbolt with a flashlight and counted strikes along the fuselage, wing root and cowl, muttering numbers under his breath like a banker doing unwanted arithmetic. When he finished, he spat into the mud and said, "Bring back a liquid-cooled fighter looking like this, and all you've brought back is a burial detail." That was the crew chief's way of praising an airplane. No speech, no theory, just respect for a machine that kept returning with damage severe enough to insult probability. The Thunderbolt's armament also demanded a new kind of respect. The early production P-47s carried 8 50-caliber machine guns in the wings. In later versions, the aircraft could also carry bombs or rockets, but even before ground attack became its second life, the aircraft's basic gun battery was already changing pilot expectations. 8 guns, a stable firing platform, hundreds of rounds per gun. Not a dramatic cannon shell, a storm. Tom fired his first truly deliberate burst in combat in May and came away more unsettled than triumphant. The guns did not crack in separate little notes. They hammered together. What the pilot saw in front of him did not so much get hit as get erased in lines. By early summer, Tom's squadron was learning the first real rule of Jug combat. Do not turn with them if you do not have to. Do not climb into vanity at low altitude. Take altitude like money. Spend it fast. Hit once. Recover. Reset. It sounded almost cowardly to men raised on stories of twisting dogfights and lone aces. It was not cowardice. It was economics. A P-47 that entered the fight with speed in reserve and discipline intact became a very different machine from the one German pilots had mocked in April. Not graceful. Lethal. The man most associated with forcing that lesson into shape was Hubert Zemke. Zemke had little patience for worshipping an aircraft's weaknesses. He stressed the Thunderbolt's dive performance and roll rate, built tactics around what it did well, and helped turn the 56 Fighter Group into the sort of unit German pilots stopped taking lightly. His dive, fire, and recover emphasis matched the aircraft's character perfectly. He also pushed discipline, teamwork. the kind of cold aerial professionalism that turns a blunt machine into a polished weapon. What they did not know yet, on the German side, was that tactics were catching up to the airframe. Once that happened, the laughter had an expiration date. June 26, 1943, the day Robert S. Johnson became part legend, part warning. Johnson, flying a P-47 with the 56th Fighter Group, was badly shot up in combat over the Channel. Later, he would recall that the Thunderbolt absorbed punishment no other fighter he knew could have taken. He remembered 21 20mm cannon shell hits in the aircraft and over 100 bullet strikes. The canopy shattered. Hydraulics failed. The machine became a wreck around him. Yet it kept flying. Then a German fighter found the crippled jug and attacked again, and again, and again. Still it did not fall. From the German side, that kind of incident felt offensive, not merely surprising. Offensive. A veteran pilot expected certain visible results from effective gunfire. Fire, structural breakup, spin, the silent downward plunge that means a fight is finished whether anyone saw a parachute or not. But the Thunderbolt kept violating the old visual grammar of destruction. Carl heard about Johnson's survival through the loose, uneasy chain by which combat miracles travel through squadrons. At first, he dismissed it as exaggeration. Every Air Force manufactures myths out of improbabilities. Then multiple reports began aligning. Heavy damage, American fighter still returns. Again, again, again. The statistics told another story. Not every jug survived. Enough did. Tom heard the Johnson story on the American side as something more practical than myth. It was not told as romance. It was told as proof. Proof that the radial engine mattered. Proof that structural thickness mattered. Proof that armor and brute force engineering could buy a pilot seconds, minutes, maybe a whole life. The P-47 was not the sort of fighter a peacetime Air Force would necessarily have called elegant. War had stopped asking for elegance. War wanted aircraft that came home. And the more Tom saw of escorts over France, the more he understood a quiet truth. Bravery matters. Skill matters. But in a war of attrition, the airplane that brings one more trained pilot back is already doing strategic work. Carl's opinion began changing not all at once, but in the miserable increments of professional experience. A pass that should have killed but only damaged. A pursuit dive that became too dangerous to continue. A firing solution ruined by a P-47's abrupt roll and slashing escape. Another mission in which the Americans refused a turning fight and simply vanished downhill until the speed differential became absurd. This annoyed German veterans more than flamboyant skill would have. An opponent who outturned you could at least be admired. An opponent who declined the wrong fight and lived felt insulting. But insult, repeated often enough, becomes doctrine in the other man's hands and frustration in yours. By late summer 1943, the P-47 groups over Europe were no longer behaving like awkward visitors. They were starting to look like a force. Formations held altitude more deliberately. Elements supported one another more cleanly. Attacks came in harder, shorter, less emotional bursts. Tom could feel the change from inside it. Briefings became less about surviving first contact and more about forcing geometry, height, position, mutual support. Never give away speed simply because the enemy wants a swirling, dramatic fight. A jug flown that way no longer felt like a compromise. It felt like a choice. The bomber offensive deepened that choice. The Thunderbolt had been conceived as a high-altitude escort fighter before it ever became the feared fighter bomber of 1944 and 1945. Its range, especially early on, created difficulties. But within the distances it could cover, the aircraft proved increasingly valuable above the bomber stream. That mattered because bomber escort is not a duelist's assignment. It is systems work, altitude corridors, timed rendezvous, fuel discipline, protective aggression. The Thunderbolt fit that world better than many of its first critics had guessed. With a 42,000-foot ceiling and speed in the climb, when handled properly, it belonged in the cold upper air where bomber wars were decided. Tom flew one of those bitter high-altitude missions in August and discovered that combat at 25,000 feet had less to do with heroics than with endurance. The cockpit was cold enough to feel metallic in the lungs. The bomber stream droned beneath them, massive and patient. Contrails formed, tangled, spread, and became the visible handwriting of entire formations. Then German fighters appeared. Not many at first, enough. Tom rolled in from above with his wingman and fired at a crossing enemy aircraft, not because the moment felt grand, but because training, speed, and angle had finally aligned. His burst lasted perhaps a second. The German fighter broke apart along the fuselage and disappeared beneath the haze. 1 second. That was all 8 guns needed when the setup was correct. German pilots increasingly noticed the Thunderbolt not only as an aircraft, but as a sound. The deep growl of the radial engine differed from the cleaner note of inline fighters. In the air, that mattered less than on the ground. But on airfields, roads, forward strips, and transport routes, men learned to recognize the approaching note before they identified the silhouette. Later versions with broad-bladed propellers deepened the personality further. It was not the shrill menace of a dueling aircraft. It was something heavier, a machine announcing that speed, weight, and violence were arriving together. The first time men laugh at a machine, they usually laugh at how it looks. The last time, if they are still alive, they remember how it sounded. The numbers told another story. The Thunderbolt could carry either 6 or 8.50 caliber machine guns depending on variant, but the war made the 8-gun image famous. It could also carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or 10 rockets in later configurations. With an engine producing roughly 2,000 horsepower in popular memory and over 2,400 horsepower in some late-war technical forms, the aircraft combined brawler's strength with altitude lungs few opponents liked facing. The Smithsonian would later describe Thunderbolt pilots flying into battle with the roar of a 2,000 horsepower radial engine and the flash of 8.50s. That description was clean. Combat was not. Combat was what happened when those numbers met men. On the German side, veterans like Karl still told themselves that statistics did not dogfight. Pilots did. There was truth in that, but only partial truth. Because statistics shape who gets the chance to dogfight tomorrow. How many aircraft are available? How many trained replacements arrive? How much fuel exists for practice? How much ammunition can be spent in training without commanders wringing their hands over waste? By late 1943, Karl was noticing an ugly asymmetry. Every German veteran lost left a gap difficult to fill. American losses hurt too, but the force as a whole kept thickening. The sky was beginning to feel less like a contest of equals and more like an argument about endurance. That autumn also began teaching Tom something darker. The Thunderbolt's real strength did not only lie in killing enemy fighters, it lay in giving its own pilots margin. Margin when hit, margin in the dive, margin in the gun battery, margin in ruggedness. A delicate aircraft flatters talent right up until the moment a lucky shell, or a rough landing, or a burst through the coolant system ends the conversation permanently. The jug rarely felt delicate. It felt like a machine built by men who had decided that if physics required size and weight to keep one more pilot alive, then size and weight were virtues. That philosophy would scale far beyond the cockpit. October 1943. Some rather bitter mission at altitude. Karl's unit climbed to intercept heavy bombers and found the escort thicker, more deliberate, and more aggressively placed than before. The Germans still possessed skill, daring, and individual brilliance. But more and more often, the first clean attack was denied by American fighters already in the right place. A Thunderbolt diving from above was a simple problem in theory. Brake, roll, spoil the angle. In practice, the Americans were getting better at timing their slashing attacks, so German fighters had too little time to settle into old instincts. That was the difference. The P-47 had not magically become graceful. Its pilots had become less foolish in it. The transformation had begun. Not complete, not irreversible, but visible. Tom started hearing fewer jokes inside his own squadrons about the jug being too fat to fight. Men still cursed its landings, still sweated its dive behavior, still respected how quickly carelessness in the aircraft could be punished, but they trusted it now. That trust changes how pilots carry themselves. A machine you merely tolerate feels like a burden. A machine you trust becomes an extension of judgment. For Tom, the shift came quietly one grey morning, when he realized he no longer compared the Thunderbolt to anything else. He simply thought in terms of what the Jug would want here. There. Now. What they did not know yet on the German side was how quickly American refinement could alter an existing problem. Early in 1944, improved propellers and continual tweaks began addressing one of the Thunderbolt's most mocked characteristics. The paddle blade propeller on later versions helped the aircraft climb and accelerate better, narrowing assumptions German pilots had grown comfortable making. Comfort is lethal in war. Karl learned this on a winter escort interception when a P-47 stayed with a maneuver longer than it should have if he had been flying the old mental picture in his head. The American did not outturn him. It simply remained dangerous longer than expected. Sometimes that is enough to kill a man. January 1944. Tom stood beside one of the newer Thunderbolts and looked at the broad propeller blades with the same cautious hope men reserve for promises they have learned not to trust too quickly. Ground crews were enthusiastic. Pilots were skeptical. Then he flew it. The Jug did not become light. It did not suddenly flutter upward like a Spitfire. It became more willing to bite into the climb, more willing to turn horsepower into acceleration, more willing to gather energy fast enough that old complaints no longer landed quite the same way. On the ground afterward, Tom grinned in spite of himself. The airplane had not changed species. It had simply become a better version of its own brutality. Karl felt the difference before he could name it. That was the terrifying part. Experienced pilots live by expectations. Altitude responses, closure rates, energy decay, the subtle mental arithmetic that tells a veteran what another aircraft can and cannot still do from a certain position. The improved Thunderbolts began corrupting that arithmetic, not destroying it, corrupting it. A little more climb here, a little more acceleration there, a little less delay before the American fighter became threatening. An enemy that improves from clumsy to competent is dangerous. An enemy that improves from competent to methodical is much worse. The tactical philosophy around the escort was improving too. American fighters were increasingly released from the old rigid idea that their only task was to stay close to bombers in visible moral support. Men like Zemke pushed more aggressive methods. The escort could spread, fan, and intercept threats before those threats fully formed. Later, variants of the Zemke fan idea would become famous. The concept was devastatingly simple. Do not wait for the enemy to arrange his attack neatly. Break his arrangement first. For a heavy fighter once laughed at for lacking elegance, it was the perfect operational revenge. The Jug did not need to win a duel if it could ruin the duel before it began. May 12, 1944. High over Germany, Karl saw the escort break away from the bombers in a broad, searching arc and immediately sensed that something old had ended. The Americans were no longer chained to passive protection. They were hunting the approach lanes. They were reaching out, interfering, punishing assembly itself. German fighter doctrine had long depended on creating favorable attack geometry against bomber formations. Now American Thunderbolts and other escorts were attacking the very process of forming those attacks. Karl rolled his Focke-Wulf toward a gap and found it filled almost instantly by diving P-47s. Not graceful, not theatrical, effective. The numbers told another story. Skill was still present on both sides. Initiative had started changing owners. Tom experienced the same battle as a kind of managed violence. They were not improvising in the old romantic sense. They were executing. Altitude, timing, spacing, attack window, recover, reform. The Thunderbolt felt increasingly natural in precisely that sort of fighting. Use the dive, fire once with authority, recover while still owning enough speed to refuse the wrong answer. He attacked a German formation before it could settle into a clean bomber run, and for the first time felt what the Jug had been trying to teach him for almost a year. This airplane did not want to be admired. It wanted to dominate process. That was subtler than showmanship, and far more dangerous. By June 1944, the P-47 had become one of the familiar shapes of Allied air power over Western Europe. That mattered, because familiarity at the front does not mean weakness. It means saturation. The Germans were seeing the same broad silhouette in too many roles too often. Escort fighter one day, fighter sweep the next, road hunter after that. The aircraft's value had ceased to depend on novelty. Instead, it depended on recurrence. The same machine, the same deep engine note, the same slashing pass, the same refusal to stay and argue with physics after delivering violence. Routine is one of war's great destroyers. An enemy that becomes routine becomes part of your calculations before you ever reach the battlefield. June 6, 1944. Dawn over the Channel. Tom had never seen so many ships on one piece of water in his life. The invasion fleet seemed less assembled than grown, steel flowering outward across the sea, in white wakes and grey hulls without end. Under that sky, the Thunderbolts flew not as a curiosity and not as an experiment, but as part of an Allied air umbrella, so dense the Luftwaffe could scarcely approach the beaches without paying for the privilege immediately. Tom looked down at the armada, then inland towards smoke beginning to rise beyond Normandy, and understood in his bones what a mature war machine looked like. It looked layered. For Karl, D-Day revealed the strategic version of a lesson he had been learning tactically for more than a year. The Thunderbolt alone was not the whole problem. The Thunderbolt inside the Allied system was, above the beaches, over the approach routes, inland over roads and likely assembly points. Allied aircraft occupied so many levels of the sky that German pilots found themselves fighting not for superiority, but for access. Access to the beaches, access to the bombers, access to any clean attack at all. That is how an air force dies before every one of its aircraft is destroyed. Not by one spectacular loss, by gradually being denied useful sky. In the days immediately after the landings, Tom watched the Thunderbolt begin its other famous life in earnest. The fighter bomber. This transition had been developing already, but Normandy gave it a battlefield vast enough to display its full logic. The P-47 could dive hard, absorb punishment, carry bombs or rockets, and then still strafe with 8 heavy machine guns. In ground attack, those virtues became brutal. Tom's first serious low-level strike on a road column left him shaken. Aircraft combat has distance in it. Road attacks do not. You see trucks, canvas, men diving into ditches, the road itself trying to hold formation longer than the humans on it. Then the guns hit, and the road stops being a road. German troops quickly learned the vocabulary of the new threat, Yabos, fighter bombers. But among those dreaded categories, the Thunderbolt gained a specific reputation. It did not just attack. It attacked with speed, weight, and a terrifying ability to come low, survive ground fire, and come again. Karl heard the reports from soldiers and officers moving back from Normandy. Crossroads destroyed, fuel trains burned, horse teams shredded, staff cars split open on narrow roads, columns trapped because the first vehicles were destroyed and the last vehicles had already bunched up behind them. The Americans had not merely landed. They had brought flying roadblocks with them. The numbers told another story. A P-47D could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or 10 rockets. That meant the aircraft that had first impressed itself on Europe as a high-altitude escort fighter could descend later in the war carrying a bomb load comparable to some early medium bombers. Add 850s after release, and the road beneath it became a brief problem in applied mathematics. How much steel? How much fuel? How much fear? How much delay? Tom no longer thought of each mission as an isolated little drama. He began understanding that every convoy hit, every bridge cratered, every locomotive burned, changed what some German commander could not do that evening. That was how air power enters logistics. Karl learned the same lesson from the other direction. By July 1944, men arriving from the West no longer described air attacks merely as casualties. They described them as interruptions. The column never arrived. The ammunition remained somewhere behind a smoking road bend. The fuel did not reach the tanks. The headquarters had to move because staff cars and radio trucks had been attacked. The orders came too late because the messenger never got through. That was why the Thunderbolt was becoming so hated on the ground. It did not need to destroy an entire division. It only needed to break the timing between its parts. Tom's crew chief, Eddie Nolan, loved the jug in precisely the unromantic way men love tools that do difficult work without demanding constant apology. He patched flak damage, realigned guns, inspected propeller nicks, cursed hydraulic leaks. And every time another Thunderbolt returned with skin torn open and systems wounded but pilot alive, his opinion hardened further. One evening, Tom came back from a road strike with holes punched along the wing and cowling. Nolan looked at the damage, ran a finger along a jagged tear, and said, "This thing isn't a lady, it's a boiler." Tom laughed. Nolan did not. To him, it was praise. The summer breakout from Normandy widened the Thunderbolt's hunting ground dramatically. Once Allied armies pushed into open country, and the German retreat became a war of roads, movement, and desperate improvisation, the P-47 found the landscape it had been waiting for. Hedgerow claustrophobia gave way to long roads, bridges, traffic bunches, rail lines, columns trying to move by half-light, and fuel convoys, hoping the weather would buy them one more day. It was the perfect environment for a fast, rugged fighter bomber. Not because the work was easy, because the targets had nowhere to hide except time, darkness, and cloud, and America kept trying to take all three away. August 1944. Somewhere on a road east of the Seine, a German truck driver looked up too late and saw only the underside of a Thunderbolt before the first burst hit. Stories like that multiplied faster than official reports. A village square where 3 vehicles burned and blocked everything behind them. A bridge approach cratered under bombs. A locomotive stopped by strafing and abandoned by its crew. An ambulance hit because war had become too fast and too vicious for tidy moral categories in the air. Karl did not need to witness every strike personally to understand the cumulative effect. The air war had descended into the bloodstream of the German army, and the jug was one of the needles. What they did not understand yet in Berlin was that the fighter they had mocked in 1943 had become useful in too many dimensions at once. By autumn 1944, the P-47 was no longer judged merely as a fighter against other fighters. It was judged by how much pressure it could apply across the entire battlefield. Escort work, sweeps, armed reconnaissance, rail attacks, road interdiction, close support, airfield suppression. The aircraft was becoming less like a specialist and more like an operational habit. Tom felt that shift in briefings. One morning escort, that afternoon bombs on a road junction. 2 days later, low-level reconnaissance, then back to fighter cover. The jug did not seem confused by the workload. It seemed born for repetition. The numbers told another story. By the end of the war, more than 15,600 Thunderbolts would be built. The United States built more P-47s than any other American fighter airplane. That kind of production changes how a war sounds and feels. It means losses can be absorbed. It means training and tactics are applied across thousands of machines instead of dozens. It means a type can be refined in the field while still remaining common enough to matter everywhere. Karl knew none of the exact final totals in 1944. He did not need to. He could already feel abundance in the sky. There is a kind of despair that enters experienced soldiers, not when the enemy is merely strong, but when the enemy seems endless. By September 1944, that despair was visiting the Luftwaffe in fragments. Not spoken openly, implied. A young replacement asking whether there would be escorts again tomorrow, and receiving no reassuring lie in response. A crew chief staring too long at another aircraft arriving with damage that could not be fixed quickly because parts, men, or time were lacking. A veteran pilot hearing Thunderbolts over a road attack, then over a rail strike, then over the bomber stream, and realizing the aircraft was beginning to feel omnipresent. The transformation had begun. Now it was spreading. Tom watched the war widen into France, with the numb focus only sustained fatigue can produce. The missions blended together in bodily memory, sweat under the parachute harness, oil and cordite in the cockpit, maps folded and unfolded until they lost clean edges, the sudden violence of flak, the heavier silence after a good strafing run, when no one on the radio needed to say that the column below was no longer moving. By then he had stopped wondering whether the P-47 was ideal. War does not reward the ideal. It rewards what works often. That was the jug's secret. Not perfection, reliability at scale. Autumn 1944 also brought a grim German education in American operational confidence. The Thunderbolt's role within the broader Allied air system showed that the United States and its allies were no longer improvising around a new fighter type. They were integrating it into mature doctrine. Bombers knew it. Ground forces knew it. Army commanders relied on it. Airfields supported it. Depots fed it. Mechanics turned it around. Pilots entered combat already understanding what the aircraft asked and did not ask. That sort of doctrinal maturity is invisible in peacetime parades. In war, it becomes one of the heaviest things in the sky. Carl could feel it without naming it. The Americans seemed settled into themselves. One of the reasons the Thunderbolt felt premium to those fighting against it was that it generated mini-stories almost everywhere it went. Robert Johnson surviving absurd punishment. Hub Zemke shaping tactics around dive, fire, and recover. Pilots and crew chiefs passing along stories of holes counted in dozens. German road units reporting that the fat American fighter they had once heard mocked could come screaming down with bombs, then rake a road with its guns like mobile artillery. Tom heard these stories on the American side as morale. Carl heard them on the German side as corrosion. Either way, the aircraft was becoming larger than its specifications. It was becoming a reputation. The statistics told another story. By late-war technical notes, a P-47D could range roughly 1,030 miles, depending on load and profile. That did not solve every escort problem early in the war, but as tactics, drop tanks, and mission planning improved, the Thunderbolt's usefulness expanded. Meanwhile, later bubble canopy versions improved rearward vision, another quiet, practical refinement that mattered to men trying not to die when attacks came from above and behind. War is partly decided by glamorous inventions. It is also decided by view, fuel, maintenance, and repeatable design improvements no civilian will ever applaud on first sight. The Jug collected those improvements methodically. December 1944. The Ardennes. For a few precious days, bad weather gave Germany what tactical brilliance and dwindling resources no longer could. Space. Cloud and snow narrowed the Allied advantage in the air, and let German ground forces surge forward under a lid of weather that grounded or reduced many of the aircraft that had made daylight movement so dangerous for months. Carl knew exactly what that meant. If the skies stayed shut, the roads below might live. If the roads lived, fuel and ammunition might reach the spearheads. If the spearheads reached far enough, perhaps surprise could substitute briefly for shortage. It was a desperate arithmetic. But desperate arithmetic is still arithmetic. Tom and his squadron waited through those foul weather days with the frustrated patience of men who had grown used to influence. The front moved while the clouds denied them full access. Reports came in from the ground. German columns, armor, breakthroughs, road fights, frozen villages. The battlefield was changing under weather that felt almost personal in its obstruction. The Thunderbolts sat or flew reduced missions and waited for the moment the sky would open again. That anticipation mattered, because everyone on both sides knew what the return of clear weather meant. The German offensive was not only fighting Allied armies, it was racing a calendar in the clouds. December 24, 1944. The weather broke. That fact, by itself, was enough to alter the campaign. Thunderbolts took to the air over the Ardennes and found a battlefield crowded with exactly the sort of targets that had made the aircraft feared since Normandy. Columns moving on constricted roads, fuel vehicles, bridges, artillery positions, armor temporarily exposed by movement and congestion. Tom rolled into attack after attack over snow-lined roads where every black shape stood out brutally against winter ground. The Jug's great wartime habit returned at once. See movement, convert altitude into speed, strike once with authority, climb out alive, come back if needed. The numbers told another story. The German offensive had lost the sky again. Carl experienced the same day as a narrowing. The offensive still possessed violence, still possessed local skill, still possessed men capable of extraordinary stubbornness in forests and villages. But once Allied fighter bombers returned in serious numbers, daylight movement once more became an exposed nerve. Roads jammed, vehicles burned, fuel vanished not only because there was too little of it, but because what existed could not be moved cleanly under attack. Veterans like Carl had always understood that air superiority mattered. The winter of 1944 taught them again that road superiority mattered almost as much, and the P-47 had become one of the aircraft most associated with taking roads away. The statistics told another story. A single P-47 could carry bombs, rockets, and heavy machine guns, But the true weapon was not only any one aircraft's load, it was repetition, sortie after sortie, squadron after squadron, aircraft returning, rearming, and launching again. Men on the receiving end do not remember theory. They remember the feeling that every time the weather clears, the same enemy returns. That was why Thunderbolts generated such psychological pressure in late 1944 and early 1945. They made weather feel political. Cloud was mercy. Clear air was punishment. January 1st, 1945. The Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, the desperate New Year's blow against Allied airfields. For a few moments on some fields it worked. Aircraft burned on the ground. Surprise reappeared. The old German dream of a clean tactical strike against inattentive enemies flashed back to life. But only briefly. That was the tragedy of late-war German planning. Even when the attack inflicted real damage, Germany lacked the reserve to turn damage into decision. Tom reached the field after the first shock and saw burning aircraft, ground crews dragging hoses, ambulances cutting across the edges of chaos. Then he saw something else, order returning faster than the Germans could afford to imagine. On the German side, pilots who survived Bodenplatte paid for the attack with the most precious remaining currency Germany possessed: experience. Every late-war operation that consumed skilled men in one dramatic gesture deepened the long defeat. Aircraft could be built. Sometimes, fuel could be found. Occasionally, but a trained, living veteran pilot could not be mass-produced in January 1945 by a nation already collapsing under strategic bombing, shortage, and retreat. Karl flew that winter with more and more replacements, whose training hours felt scandalously thin. They were brave enough. Bravery was no longer the scarce resource. Time was. And the Americans had more of it because their system kept men, machines, and doctrine alive together. Tom's side had losses too. Men were killed in flak, in weather, in ground attack runs gone low and wrong, in sudden fighter encounters, and in the endless minor cruelties of wartime aviation. But behind those losses stood something the Germans increasingly lacked: replacement structure. New aircraft, parts, fuel, training pipelines. The Thunderbolt was not frightening only because of how it fought in the air. It was frightening because every jug shot down hinted that more would appear. By 1945, the P-47 did not represent a squadron alone. It represented American continuity. The numbers told another story. At peak wartime scale, Republic's production of the Thunderbolt reached a level unimaginable to most European observers. The Farmingdale plant and the Evansville plant fed the force relentlessly. By the end, the total exceeded 15,600 built. The National Museum of the United States Air Force notes that the Thunderbolt served in almost every active theater of the war and in several Allied air forces. That last point mattered. The P-47 was not a local improvisation. It was an industrial argument exported across the war. Karl did not need the museum plaque to know that. He had lived under the shadow of its production. By February 1945, Tom's missions over Germany itself carried a new sensation. Not victory exactly. Weight. Rail yards torn apart. Smoke columns from factories. Bridges watched or broken. Columns moving in increasingly ragged patterns. The Luftwaffe still appeared sometimes, and when it did, it could still kill. No experienced pilot ever forgot that. But its appearances had become episodic rather than governing. The force that had once shaped the tempo of aerial combat was now reacting to the tempo of Allied pressure. The jug fit perfectly into that late-war environment, no longer proving itself, simply working. Karl flew with boys now, not literally children, but young men so undertrained that their faces seemed wrong inside the cockpit culture of a war this old. They listened carefully when he told them the rules. Do not underestimate the Thunderbolt because it looks heavy. Do not follow it blindly in a dive. Do not assume a damaged jug is finished. Do not stay low if the Americans have height. Do not think courage alone can repair bad geometry. Some understood. Some died too soon to prove they had understood. That was late-war Luftwaffe life. Wisdom acquired at a cost no nation could still afford to pay. One of those replacements asked Karl a question after a mission. If their fighter is so heavy, the boy said, Why does it still keep winning useful fights? Karl answered more honestly than he intended. Because they are not asking it to be elegant. The boy frowned. Karl looked out toward the revetments where another aircraft was being patched with whatever parts could still be found and added, "They are asking it to return." That was the deeper point. A fighter that returns can be flown again. A pilot who returns learns. A squadron that returns develops habit. And habit, scaled through industry, becomes harder to defeat than brilliance. The Thunderbolt's reputation also widened beyond Europe. Though the drama of this story lay mostly over France and Germany, the P-47 proved itself in other theaters as well. In the Pacific, later P-47Ns were built specifically for long-range work, their altered wings and fuel capacity suited to the vast distances of that war. That mattered because it confirmed something about the type's design philosophy. The Jug was not a fragile local answer. It was a family of heavy, adaptable war tools. America was not merely refining one fighter for one battlefield. It was scaling a concept. That frightened professional enemies more than any single combat anecdote. Tom himself cared less about Pacific variants than about the next morning's fuel state and ammunition load, but he knew the larger implication without having to say it aloud. This airplane existed in depth. Depth of production, depth of roles, depth of technical development, depth of replacement. That is why the late-war Thunderbolt felt different from aircraft that burned brightly but narrowly. The Jug belonged to a civilization that could afford continuity. When a machine becomes continuous, it stops being a weapon in the narrow sense. It becomes climate. The statistics told another story. The Thunderbolt's sturdy construction and air-cooled radial engine gave it the reputation the National Museum later summarized succinctly. It could absorb severe battle damage and keep flying. That was more than a museum phrase. It was the operational foundation for why the aircraft became so valuable as both escort fighter and low-level fighter bomber. At altitude, that meant survivors. Near the ground, it meant pilots willing to attack through flak because they trusted the machine more than they would trust something delicate. Trust changes violence. A trusted aircraft is used more boldly. March 1945. Tom's squadron attacked locomotives at dawn. The first pass hit near the engine and slowed the train. The second shattered the illusion that the line would keep moving. Other Thunderbolts came in behind, and what had been a railway problem became a small industrial obituary in smoke and twisted metal. Tom climbed away through scattered light flak and realized how far the aircraft's identity had traveled since 1943. This same machine, or rather, this same family of machines, had entered Europe under laughter because it seemed too large for a real fighter. Now, it was cutting rail movement inside Germany itself. History had proved otherwise. Karl's last months in combat compressed years of understanding into seconds of procedure. Take off, climb, check the sun, check above. Listen for fragmentary vectors that came too late. Assume the escorts might already be somewhere uncomfortable. Assume the roads below were already unsafe. Assume fuel would matter. Assume numbers were not on your side. That accumulation of assumptions is what defeat feels like before surrender becomes paperwork. The Thunderbolt was not alone in creating that feeling, but it was one of the aircraft most consistently present inside it. That presence mattered. War becomes memory through recurrence. The numbers told another story. The P-47D's technical notes list a crew of 1, a loaded weight around 17,500 pounds, and a maximum speed around 433 miles per hour. To civilians, such numbers may seem like a cold index. To pilots, they mean something else. How fast escape can become, how much mass enters the dive, how much structure exists between a shell hit and the pilot's spine, how much ordnance can be carried before the aircraft stops being itself. The Thunderbolt's numbers were never graceful on paper, they were persuasive in war. Tom saw his first jet only fleetingly, a rumor with shape, a grey impossibility moving faster than anything propeller-driven had a right to catch in clean level flight. But even the arrival of jets did not make the Thunderbolt irrelevant. Under the right conditions, especially in dives or around takeoff and landing patterns, piston fighters could still be dangerous to Germany's late miracle weapons. That fact said less about jets than about the condition of the Reich that fielded them. A new machine is not enough when fuel, pilots, dispersal, and airfield security are collapsing all around it. Industrial modernity without strategic stability is just a faster failure. Karl watched Germany put faith in miracle edges while the middle of the war machine dissolved. Jets, new plans, new orders, new offensives. Yet the same old shortages stalked everything. Fuel, training, road movement, security in daylight, repair capacity. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to multiply the useful value of ordinary things already present in volume. Trucks, fuel, escort doctrine, ground crews and aircraft like the Thunderbolt that grew more effective the longer the system around them matured. This was the most painful professional realization of all. Germany had bet on brilliance. America had bet on repeatability. Repeatability was winning. April 1945. Karl took off one final time without knowing it would be his last combat sortie. No one ever really knows. The mission was confused from the first minute. Incomplete intelligence, weak control, too little fuel comfort, too many American aircraft reported in too many sectors. The war no longer moved in crisp plans. It frayed. Then he saw them. Thunderbolts, high enough to own initiative, numerous enough to shape choice. For 1 second, Karl remembered the first time he had seen that same broad silhouette over France and dismissed it with contempt. Then the dive began, and memory gave way to procedure. Tom, somewhere else in that same collapsing month, pushed down through patchy spring cloud on a road movement that looked more like evacuation than maneuver. Trucks, horse carts, civilian wagons, military remnants, and staff vehicles all shared the same broken geometry now. The war had stopped separating categories cleanly. He hit the road because it was moving. That is an ugly sentence. It is also a true one. At the end of great wars, machines often continue doing the work they were shaped to do long after human categories have started blurring into rubble. The Jug had become one of those machines, built to carry pressure, then to apply it everywhere. Karl's aircraft took hits in the first pass, sharp shudders through the wing, a burst of warning lights, the engine still running, but not trustworthily. He had enough altitude and enough luck to leave the cockpit under parachute. That, too, was a kind of summary. In 1943, he had laughed at a heavy American fighter that looked too clumsy to master the European sky. In 1945, he descended beneath silk while more of those same fighters moved eastward toward their next targets without pausing to admire the result. The Americans were not staying to celebrate. They no longer needed to. They had work ahead. From the parachute, Karl saw smoke columns on the horizon and understood the war in one unpleasant image. Multiple fires, no center, no clear line holding them together anymore. That is what collapse looks like from above. Not one great cinematic explosion. Systems failing into one another. Airfields unsafe, roads unsafe, railways unsafe, headquarters displaced, pilots scattered, fuel absent, and over all of it, the deep recurring note of Allied aircraft, among them the Thunderbolts that had once seemed so easy to mock. History had proved otherwise. By then, history no longer cared what any individual pilot thought of it. Tom survived long enough to experience one of war's strangest sensations. Familiarity with survival. Not relief exactly. A harder thing. The knowledge that the aircraft had kept him alive enough times that he no longer looked at it with surprise. The Jug was simply there. Oil-stained, loud, patched, broad-winged, and increasingly symbolic of a war nearing conclusion on terms favorable to the side that had built it in absurd numbers and then taught men to use it without vanity. He stood beside his Thunderbolt one evening and realized he had stopped comparing it to prettier fighters long ago. Beauty was a pre-war question. This was a war answer. The numbers told another story. The National Museum records that the Thunderbolt served in almost every active war theater and in the forces of several Allied nations. That sentence sounds tidy. Its wartime reality was not. It meant thousands of sorties, endless maintenance, gun harmonization, bomb racks, replacement pilots, technical bulletins, tactical notes, damaged aircraft cannibalized or repaired, and factories in America turning out more machines while Europe's industrial heartland burned. Karl understood that only vaguely during the war. Tom understood almost none of it, yet both men lived inside its consequences. That is what large systems do. They become fate for individuals. By the time Germany surrendered, the Luftwaffe existed in fragments. Some brave, some skillful, some still technically dangerous, but broken as a governing force. The road to that collapse ran through many causes: strategic bombing, fuel disaster, pilot attrition, command strain, and Allied overwhelming material power. Yet, in the Western Air War, the P-47 Thunderbolt had played its own unmistakable role. It had escorted bombers, killed fighters, ruled roads, destroyed movement, kept trained Americans alive who might otherwise have been lost. And perhaps most humiliating of all for its critics, it had done so while remaining unmistakably itself: heavy, broad, unapologetic. There is a reason veteran enemies remember certain aircraft more vividly than others, not always because those aircraft were the most elegant, often because they represented a style of war the veteran eventually realized he could not solve. For Karl, the Thunderbolt became exactly that memory. Not the most beautiful aircraft he had ever seen, not even always the most tactically brilliant opponent in a single turning engagement. Something more troubling, a machine whose strengths aligned too well with the long war Germany had no resources left to survive. That is the kind of opponent professionals remember longest. The statistics told another story. More than 15,600 Thunderbolts built, a maximum speed around 433 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 42,000 feet, a warload that could include bombs, rockets, and 8 wing-mounted heavy machine guns, a rugged air-cooled radial engine at its heart. Those numbers made the museum placards and reference manuals, but the real total was measured differently, in missions that made roads unusable, in pilots brought home, in German veterans who heard the same deep engine note too many times over too many fronts, in a sky that changed ownership, one repeated sortie at a time. Tom's crew chief gave the final technical verdict in simpler words. Late one evening after the war in Europe was effectively decided, Nolan stood beneath the wing with a wrench in one hand, looked up at the patched skin of the aircraft, and said, "Everybody wanted a dancer. What won was a hammer that could fly." Tom laughed, then stopped laughing, because the sentence had too much truth in it. The jug had never charmed anyone honest on first sight. It had to prove itself the hard way, through work, through damage, through repetition, through not dying when something prettier might have died. What they did not know yet in April 1943, when the first contemptuous glances fell from German canopies, was that the Thunderbolt's greatest advantage would not be any single performance figure. Not climb rate, not dive speed, not altitude, not even the 8 guns. Its greatest advantage would be coherence. The airplane made sense inside American production logic, American tactical learning, and American attritional patience. As those elements matured, the aircraft's usefulness multiplied. Karl could not see that from 27,000 feet over France. Tom could not see it from inside a rookie's fear. History could, and history was already choosing. That is why the story of the P-47 is not really a story about an ugly aircraft unexpectedly becoming glamorous. It is about an ugly aircraft revealing that glamour had become strategically unimportant. The Luftwaffe had spent years teaching the world to admire agility, aggression, and the clean, violent intelligence of trained fighter pilots. All of that remained real. All of it remained deadly. But the Thunderbolt introduced another principle: survive, return, be maintained, be flown again, be produced in numbers, learn tactically, scale operationally. That sequence does not look poetic on paper. In war, it becomes poetry written in outcomes. The mini-stories piled up because the machine kept creating the conditions for them. Robert Johnson surviving what should have killed him. Hub Zemke refining the logic of how to use the aircraft instead of resenting what it was not. Crew chiefs counting holes. German road units recalling entire columns broken in minutes. Winter offensives losing momentum the moment clear skies returned. Veteran German pilots warning replacements never to underestimate the broad American fighter that looked slower than the danger it actually carried. Story by story, the P-47 became not merely a type designation, it became a lesson. Karl, after capture, would think back most often not to the first American fighter he saw explode or the last comrade he watched burn. He would think about the pattern, how the Thunderbolts had first appeared laughable, then stubborn, then irritating, then tactically inconvenient, then professionally dangerous, then operationally exhausting, then simply everywhere. That progression mattered because it mirrored Germany's own defeat. Dismiss the problem, respect the problem, run out of time solving the problem. That was the habit the Luftwaffe veterans never cracked. Tom, years later, would probably remember simpler things. The way the engine shook the airplane on the runway, the first time all 8 guns fired in anger, the shock of seeing how much damage a Jug could drag home, the weight of bombs under the wings, and the strange, almost moral nausea after a low-level road attack, the frozen air over bomber escort, the feel of the aircraft becoming lighter after release and more lethal in the climb away. Pilots remember in the body. Historians remember in the archive. The Thunderbolt survives in both. The statistics told another story. The P-47 served as both high-altitude escort fighter and low-level fighter-bomber. That double identity is what made it so devastating. Germany had prepared mentally for specialists, interceptors, bombers, dive bombers, tactical fighters. What it kept confronting instead was a heavily armed machine that could play more than one role without becoming absurd in either. That elasticity matters in attritional war. An aircraft useful in several environments multiplies the value of each production hour, each trained pilot, each ton of shipped spare parts. America understood that instinctively, even when individuals inside the process complained bitterly about the aircraft's size or habits. This is why the German jokes died, not because humor disappeared from war, because humor could no longer carry the weight of contradiction. You can laugh at a machine the first time it looks awkward in the sky. You can laugh again the second time if old assumptions still seem intact. But after the third escort mission it disrupts, the fourth convoy it shreds, the fifth pilot it brings home full of holes, the sixth road it closes, and the seventh winter offensive it helps choke in clear weather, mockery becomes nostalgia for an era. Karl recognized that too late. Most professionals do. The transformation had begun on that April morning over France, when the first German veterans looked down and saw only what the Thunderbolt lacked, what it lacked in elegance, what it lacked in climb grace, what it lacked in aesthetic credibility, according to European fighter tradition. They were asking the wrong questions. The right questions were harsher. How much punishment can it take? How much fire can it deliver? How high can it work? How often can it return? How many can America build? How quickly will its pilots learn not to misuse it? By the time the answers arrived, they came with consequences. The numbers told another story. Every extra trained American pilot, preserved by the Jug's survivability, mattered. Every German veteran lost to a slashing pass that avoided a turning contest mattered. Every road interdiction strike that delayed fuel, ammunition, or reinforcement mattered. This is how machines reshape wars without always earning the most glamorous headlines. They compound. They make tomorrow easier for one side and harder for the other. The Thunderbolt's greatness was compounding greatness. Its advantages accumulated faster than its critics' early impressions could be corrected. By then, correction no longer helped the men already dead. So what was the habit the Luftwaffe veterans never solved? It was not one maneuver, not one ace, not one gun setting, not one version of the aircraft. It was the habit of refusing the wrong fight while still forcing the right one. Climb high, arrive with speed, strike when geometry favors you, leave before vanity ruins the mathematics, return damaged if necessary, repair, refuel, rearm, launch again tomorrow, repeat until the enemy mistakes repetition for fate. That was the Jug's method. Simple enough to describe, terrible to live under. For German veterans trained in a culture that admired fighter artistry, this felt almost insulting. The Thunderbolt often denied them the kind of combat in which artistry could shine most clearly. It did not have to prove itself superior in a swirling argument if it could instead use altitude, weight, firepower, and doctrine to decide when the argument would happen at all. That was the real wound to professional pride. The Americans were not merely bringing a new airplane. They were bringing a new answer to what fighter war was supposed to value. Not style, persistence, not delicacy, margin, not one brilliant afternoon, 1,000 repeatable sorties. Tom never would have put it that way. He was too close to the metal, the weather, the fear, the next mission board. But he understood the practical version. The P-47 did not ask him to be a genius. It asked him to be disciplined, to trust speed, to trust altitude, to trust his wingman, to trust that 8 heavy machine guns fired from a stable attack pass could end problems quickly. And above all, to trust that the machine would try very hard not to die before he did. That is a profound form of loyalty in war, even when it comes wrapped in steel and oil. Carl's last honest judgment of the Thunderbolt was harsher and more respectful than anything he had felt in 1943. The Americans had not misunderstood air combat by building it. They had understood that late industrial war would reward survivability, firepower, tactical learning, and mass production as much as, or more than, aerodynamic purity. They had built a fighter around that understanding. Then they had built thousands. He might still have preferred the feel of a lighter machine in his own hands. Preference was no longer relevant. Outcome was. The Jug had become one of the outcomes. The statistics told another story. The museum descriptions mention ruggedness. The technical notes list armament, speed, range, and service ceiling. Histories praise its role as escort and fighter bomber. Pilots remember the radial engine, the dive, the shock of concentrated gunfire, and the aircraft's refusal to come apart when other types might have disintegrated. All of that is true, and yet none of it fully captures the emotional fact that mattered most to the men who fought against it. The Thunderbolt kept coming back, over France, over the Channel, over Normandy, over the roads, over Germany, until repetition itself became a weapon. That is why, if you had handed a veteran Luftwaffe pilot a photograph of the P-47 in April 1943 and asked him to predict its place in the war, he likely would have been wrong. He would have judged shape. He would have judged aesthetic logic. He would have judged climb and turn against the values the previous years had taught him to admire. He would not yet have understood that the future belonged increasingly to fighters designed not just to win moments, but to survive systems. The Thunderbolt was a system fighter long before most of its enemies realized war itself had become systematic. The laughter died in stages, first over the Channel when damaged Jugs came home, then at altitude when disciplined dive attacks began ruining clean German formations, then in Normandy when roads filled with burned transport, then in the Ardennes when clear weather returned, and with it the heavy American fighter bombers, then finally in Germany itself, when Thunderbolts no longer needed to prove anything at all. By then, there was no mockery left to defend professional pride. Only recognition, a late, expensive recognition that some machines reveal their genius only after enough men have died underestimating them. Tom's last walk around his aircraft before the end of the European War felt strangely ordinary. The same patched panels, the same grease at the seams, the same broad wing where the guns sat hidden and patient, the same engine cowling that had taken more abuse than many prettier fighters could survive. He laid a hand against the metal almost absent-mindedly. That gesture contained the whole transformation. At first, the Thunderbolt had been a problem to solve, then a burden to master, then a partner, then, eventually, a kind of fact, a hard American fact made out of aluminum, steel, oil, and return flights. Carl's memory would preserve the same aircraft differently, a shape against the sun, a laugh over the radio, then irritation, then reports, then stories of impossible survivals, then roads in France broken open, then winter movements stopped under clear skies, then too many broad-winged silhouettes in skies Germany no longer controlled. That is how defeat often arranges its symbols, not in what was most beautiful, in what kept interfering. The Thunderbolt interfered everywhere, in the air, on the roads, in logistics, in German confidence, in the time needed to recover, eventually, in the very idea that the Luftwaffe still understood the war it was fighting. So the P-47's place in history is larger than its shape. It was the American answer that seemed wrong, until the scale of the war revealed why it had been right. A fighter heavy enough to endure, powerful enough to dive, armed enough to devastate, adaptable enough to escort bombers one day and tear up roads the next, and common enough to become a recurring nightmare. The Luftwaffe veterans never solved that habit because the habit lived in more than the cockpit. It lived in factories, in tactics, in maintenance sheds, in fuel depots, in training hours, in the calm confidence of a nation that could afford to keep learning. The first time they saw the P-47, some German pilots laughed. By the last time they heard it, there was no laughter left, only the deep rolling thunder of the radial engine overhead, only the instinctive glance upward, only the quick calculation of altitude, sun, speed, and escape that came too late if the American had already arranged the fight correctly. That was the habit they never solved, not because they were fools, because by the time they understood it, the sky was already changing owners. The Thunderbolt had entered Europe looking like an American mistake. It left the war as an American method, and in the end, method beat mockery.